Dr. Mary Ruwart, welcome to the Libertarian Solution. You're here with Nick Coons, Richard Sutton, and Jimmy Anuzo.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. It's good to listen to your show, actually. It's quite interesting.
Oh, thank you. It is so much an honor to have you on the show right now. Jim asked me, because I'm such a big fan of yours and your writings and such, and Jim asked me before we were going on, are you nervous, Nick? I'm like, yeah, a little bit.
Yeah, Nick was a little giddy, so.
So thank you so much for joining us. And we were talking about charity and government involvement in charity. I don't want to specifically say government charity because that sounds like an oxymoron, but government involvement in charity. And now I know in your book, Healing Our World, you've talked quite a bit about government involvement in charity, what puts people in poverty to begin with, and why government involvement has actually made the problem worse. Can you expand on that a little bit for us?
Sure. Well, you know, today, most poverty in our country is really created by government. And I know that's kind of hard for people to believe, but, you know, when you think about it, when regulators make it very difficult for people to get a job because they need a license or the small business needs to institute certain regulatory compliance issues, people are thrown out of work, and that's really what causes poverty. The average regulator destroys about 150 private sector jobs every year. So that's pretty bad. So one of the reasons we have so much poverty in this country is we're destroying jobs. And then when we try to help them, we do it in a way that isn't a very good way. You know, I used to rent to welfare recipients, and I watched what happened. You know, they would work the system, not because they're bad people, but because it was offered to them. And when they tried to get out, when they would start, they would, have a child, for example, in high school. And, of course, a high school girl doesn't realize what life's about. And she would have a child, and that welfare check looked very enticing. So these women would come to me and say, I'm going to have a baby in a few months, and then I'll get this welfare check, and I can have an apartment. Would you rent an apartment to me? And then when they actually had the child, of course, they found out that there was much more to it than they thought. And so they had a second child to get a bigger stipend, and then a third child to get a bigger stipend, and then, of course, that was it. There was no more increases in Michigan, where I was living. And then they said, wow, I'm going to be in poverty all my life because a welfare check isn't enough to buy anything, really. And so they'd go out and try to get a job. But since they had the first child very early, they usually could only get a minimum wage or a starter job, which would have been fine if they had been in high school, but it wasn't so good when you had daycare for 3 children. So they quickly decided that wasn't a good deal, and they'd go back on welfare. If they could just stick it out for a couple years because a relative would help them, like babysitting the children or something, well, they'd get raises and everything, they'd get in the system, and they'd end up fine. But most of them were just too discouraged to try. So our system actually creates even more poverty.
Mary, where is there more opportunity? In a society that is controlled by like a centrally planned government, or in a society where cooperation or voluntary type contracts take place?
Well, the more freedom you have, the better off you are. You can actually see that the more government spends, the less we have, and the poorer we get. And this is true throughout the world. In fact, there was a study done of all the countries in the world. They measured how much of the productivity of the country that the government spent, and the more it spent, the poorer the people were. And that's because government isn't very efficient. We're actually pretty clever in how we spend our money relative to government, and you can see this just by looking at all the boondoggles and the bailouts and things of this nature that government does. So the thing to do is to have fewer regulations, fewer taxes, and relatively free trade, so that you can get all the inexpensive items from other countries. And when that happens, when countries have done that, they've gone from really impoverished nations into more prosperous ones. The Irish did this a little while back. Britain did it. New Zealand did it when they were getting bankrupt. And all of them have recovered, and it's wonderful to see.
Now, one of the arguments that people for big government charity tend to make is that, as it is right now, it might not be that great, but at least there's something guaranteed there that people are going to have. If we went to a free market-based solution where where government was completely hands-off and people gave charitably on a voluntary basis, the argument is that, well, there might be people who slip through the cracks there, so it's not very good now, but at least there's something for everyone. What would be the response to something like that?
Well, actually, in any system, there will be people slipping through the cracks. That's just life, unfortunately.
Right.
The question is, where are there more people? And there's actually more people today. For example, to get a welfare check, you have to have an address. So if you're homeless, you're automatically eliminated from the system, and you have to rely solely on private charity in most states. So, the people who really need the assistance most can't get it, which is very scary. I had a woman in my apartment complex who had a very sick child. He had a chronic disease. She found out that there would be a hospital in Tennessee that would give him free treatment, and she wanted to go. But she couldn't get, she went to the welfare office and she found out that she could not get a couple weeks of rent that she wasn't, because she'd have to be away from her job. She couldn't get that couple weeks of rent from the welfare agency. The only thing she could do would be to, go on welfare completely. And so that's what she had to end up doing. And, of course, the taxpayers had to pay for that. And the thing is about government charity, it's not only wasteful in that respect, but about 75% of the tax dollars we put aside to help the poor actually go to the social workers.
Yeah.
In a private system, it's volunteers usually distributing the money and collecting the money. And so there's very little overhead, probably about 20%. So it's just the flip side of it. And so really what welfare is, or government charity, as we've been talking about it, it's really charity for the middle class social workers is what it is.
Well, it's taking people's tax dollars and distilling it through a vast bureaucracy of grabbing hands.
Yes, it is. And every time we pay taxes, we get about, on average, half of the service that we pay for. So it's a bad deal to start with, and the reason is just what you said, because at every step of the way, we have to pay a regulator, we have to pay the tax man, or we have to pay the congressperson to decide, how the money's going to be distributed. There's always someone else to pay. Whereas when we give to someone as an individual or even to a charitable organization, we basically write that check and give it to them, and that's it. There's no middleman.
Well, and I actually know something about nonprofit charitable organizations, enough to say that if your charitable organization has more than 15% overhead, fire them.